All right, so welcome to the deep dive where we try to cut through all the noise, all the information out there, and bring you the insights that really matter. And today we're taking a deep dive into some pronouncements from the Supreme Court of India. We're going to be using the Case Cider Supreme Court Daily Digest as our kind of our roadmap, and this particular one is for March 18th and 19th, 2025. And think of this as like we've gone through all the dense legal stuff, so you don't have to.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this digest is just the range of topics that it covers. I mean, we're talking about things that impact businesses, like how they go about resolving disputes through arbitration, and then, some really intensely personal matters like child custody cases, and then really important stuff like how compensation is determined for motor vehicle accidents. It's like a wide lens on how the legal system is interpreting and applying laws in so many different situations. So what we want to do today is kind of distill that and extract the essence of what these rulings mean for you.
Yeah, definitely. So think of this as your crash course on some really important aspects of Indian law. We're going to be looking at things like why the fine print in an arbitration agreement can actually make a huge difference, and also like just this basic idea that courts are going to try to avoid interpretations that just don't make sense in the real world. So are you ready to jump in?
Yeah, let's dive in. Let's start with arbitration agreements.
Hmm.
I think one of the big takeaways here, especially if you're ever in a position where you're drafting one of these agreements or even just thinking about one, is what happens when the agreement isn't super clear.
Yeah.
What are the rules?
So let's break that down a little bit. So the digest points out that if your arbitration agreement doesn't spell out exactly how to replace an arbitrator, if that need comes up, then it's not just any old procedural rules that apply. The law that governs the agreement itself, it's called the lex arbitrator. That's what takes precedence.
Yeah, and that's a really important distinction. You
Yeah.
can't just assume that the usual rules are going to fill in the gaps.
Right.
The specific law that's attached to your agreement,
Hmm.
that's the main thing the court's going to look to. So if you're someone who's working on these agreements, being really clear about that stuff up front, that can really save a lot of headaches later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's where it gets kind of interesting. So just because you say, okay, we're going to have our arbitration in, let's say, New Delhi or Singapore or wherever,
Right.
that doesn't automatically mean that all the laws of that place are going to control everything about the arbitration.
Right.
It's actually, by default, it's what's called the lex contractus. It's the law that's tied to the underlying contract.
Right. The location matters, of course, but it's not the deciding factor. Unless both sides specifically say, "Hey, we want the laws of this place, wherever it is, to govern the arbitration," then it's the law of the contract that usually wins out. And that's another reason why, being really, really careful about how you word these things is so important.
Yeah.
You don't want to be vague because, that's just an invitation for a legal fight later on.
Right.
And nobody wants that.
No, definitely not. And so the digest also gives us some insights into like the general approach that courts take when they're interpreting contracts, and it seems like they're pretty thorough.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like the fundamental idea is that you've got to read a contract as a whole, like a complete document.
Yeah.
Courts, they're going to try to make sure that every single clause in the agreement, every part of it has some meaning, has some effect.
Hmm.
They don't want to just pick and choose which parts to pay attention to.
Right, right. So if it looks like there's a contradiction between two clauses, they're going to try to find a way to make them work together.
Right, exactly. Like, unless a clause completely clashes with the rest of the agreement,
Yeah.
like it just can't be reconciled at all, the court's going to try to make it fit.
Okay.
And that even goes for those standard clauses that you often see in contracts,
Yeah.
the ones that, kind of come prepackaged, so to speak.
Right, right.
The assumption is that those are valid and they should be enforced unless they directly contradict something specific that the parties have negotiated.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's like even the stuff that seems kind of boilerplate, you still got to pay attention to it.
You do. Like every part of that contract is there for a reason.
Right.
And the courts are going to assume that the parties meant for all of it to matter.
Right, right. Okay, so there's this phrase that pops up, actus curiae neminem cravabit. And I'm not going to try to pronounce the Latin, but what does that mean for the rest of us?
Yeah. Well, it's a long-standing legal principle. And
Yeah.
basically what it means is that an action taken by the court shouldn't unfairly harm anyone. You know, it's all about fairness. It's making sure that the judicial process itself doesn't end up creating an unfair disadvantage for someone. It's like a safeguard against unintended consequences.
So it's like saying that the legal system shouldn't accidentally punish somebody just because of something the court did.
Exactly. Exactly. It's there to protect people and make sure that just because there's a procedural step or something, that it doesn't lead to an outcome that's unfair.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, so the digest also talks about this very basic concept, especially when it comes to education, and that's eligibility. Can you get into this course or not? And they use the term sine qua non. What does that mean?
Well, sine qua non, that's Latin too, and it basically means without which not. So in the context of education, it means that you absolutely have to meet the basic requirements, the criteria to be admitted into a program. If you don't meet those, you can't even be considered, period. It's like the price of admission.
So it doesn't matter how amazing your application is. Otherwise, if you don't meet those basic requirements, it's a no go.
That's exactly it, yeah.
Okay.
It's non-negotiable.
Okay. Okay. And here's another point that really stood out to me. It seems like common sense, but it's good to see it
Yeah.
stated explicitly, and that is that courts generally try to avoid interpretations that would lead to absurd outcomes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's a key principle in legal interpretation. Whether we're talking about a contract or a law,
Hmm.
the more ridiculous or improbable an interpretation seems, the less likely a court is to accept it. They're going to go to the interpretation that's more reasonable, more logical, the one that makes sense in the context of the real world.
So it's like they're saying, "Come on, that can't be what they meant," right?
Yeah, exactly. Like they want to avoid interpretations that would just lead to completely nonsensical results,
Mhm.
something that defeats the whole purpose of the contract or the law.
Right, right. Okay, so let's talk about the mechanics of lawsuits a little bit. The digest talks about this idea of a necessary party. So why is that something that's important to keep in mind if you're ever involved in a lawsuit?
Well, a necessary party, that's someone who absolutely has to be part of the lawsuit for the case to be decided fairly and completely. If they're not involved, either as someone who's suing or someone being sued, the court can't really give a complete solution to the problem.
Right. So it's like if you're trying to resolve a dispute and there's somebody who's really central to that dispute, but they're not actually part of the lawsuit, that could be a problem.
It's a huge problem. It could mean that the whole case gets thrown out because the court can't issue a ruling that affects someone who's not even there to defend themselves.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's get into an area that's really important for a lot of people, and that's motor accident compensation. So the digest actually gives a very specific example about how the age of the deceased and the multiplier are used in calculating compensation. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, so this is really crucial information for anyone who's been in an accident or who knows someone who has. The digest says that when a motor accident claims tribunal, and that's the body that decides these cases, determines that the deceased person was 24 years old, they're supposed to use a multiplier of 18 when they're figuring out the compensation.
And just for our listeners who might not be familiar, what is a multiplier?
So a multiplier is basically it's a factor that helps estimate how much income a person would have earned over their lifetime, if they hadn't died prematurely. And it takes into account their age and what their future earning potential might have been. And it's really important to understand, and the digest makes this point, that this whole area of law is designed to be beneficial. It's supposed to help people.
Right.
The goal isn't just to say, okay, here's how much money you lost.
Right.
It's about trying to make sure that the victim's family is financially secure in the long run. It's about looking ahead and recognizing that the impact of that loss is going to be felt for years to come.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also says that the tribunal can accept the age that's recorded in the postmortem report as long as there's no other evidence that contradicts it.
Right, right. So that's kind of a practical guideline for them to use,
Yeah.
especially, if there aren't a lot of other documents available. But the big picture here is that the goal is to make sure that the compensation is just,
Yeah.
that it's fair, that it takes all the relevant factors into account.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, we're going to talk about child custody now,
Yeah.
and the digest really emphasizes a principle that I think most people would agree with.
Yeah, and that's the idea that the child's well-being is the most important thing. When a court is deciding who a child should live with, that's got to be the top priority.
And it's reassuring to see that so clearly stated, you know?
Yeah,
The child's best interests should always come first.
absolutely.
Okay, so here's a point that I found really interesting. It's about evidence in legal cases, specifically this idea of dying declarations. So what is it about a dying declaration that makes it so important in the eyes of the law?
So dying declaration, it's a statement that someone makes about the circumstances of their death.
Hmm.
And under Indian law, that statement can be used as evidence, even if the person didn't actually think they were about to die when they said it.
Really?
Yeah. The key is that the statement has to be about the circumstances of their death. And the thinking is that someone who's in that kind of situation, they're not likely to lie about what happened.
Right. So even if somebody says, "Hey, this is how I got injured," and they think they're going to be okay, but then they die later, that statement can still be used as evidence.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
The law gives those statements a lot of weight.
Okay, so the digest also gets into some of the complexities of testimony in rape cases, and specifically situations where the prosecutrix, the person who's alleging the rape, is unable to testify in court. And this is obviously a very sensitive issue.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And it's an area of law where the stakes are incredibly high. So the digest acknowledges that if the prosecutrix can't testify for whatever reason, that can potentially affect whether there's a conviction. Her testimony is really important.
Right.
But it also makes clear that just because she can't testify, it doesn't automatically mean that a conviction is impossible.
Okay.
The court can still look at other evidence, like medical evidence or circumstantial evidence, to see if there's enough to support a conviction, even without her direct testimony.
Right. So it's a really delicate balance.
It is, yeah. The system has to be fair to everyone involved, and it has to recognize how difficult it can be for victims to come forward and testify.
Yeah, absolutely. And the digest makes a really important point about when the prosecutrix is a child.
Yeah, it emphasizes that if a child is the one alleging the rape, you can't interpret their silence or their inability to describe what happened in the same way you would for an adult. Kids might not talk, or they might have trouble explaining things for a whole bunch of reasons.
Yeah.
And the courts have to be really sensitive to that.
Okay, so let's talk about cross-examination a little bit, especially when it comes to child witnesses. So what are some of the key things to keep in mind about that?
So cross-examination, it's a fundamental part of our legal system. It means that each side gets to question the other side's witnesses. And the idea is to test whether the witness is telling the truth to see if their story holds up.
Yeah.
And when it comes to kids, the digest says that there's no one-size-fits-all test for whether a child is competent to testify. Really depends on the child.
So the judge has to decide on a case-by-case basis whether the child understands what it means to tell the truth and whether they can give reliable testimony.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is interesting. The digest points out that even if a child doesn't take a formal oath before they testify, that doesn't mean their testimony can't be used.
Oh, okay.
The focus is on the substance of what they're saying,
Hmm.
whether it's believable.
So it's more about whether they're actually telling the truth rather than whether they went through a specific ritual.
Right. But the digest also says that judges need to be careful about the possibility that a child might have been coached or influenced by someone before they testify.
Hmm.
And while it's usually a good idea to have other evidence to back up a child's testimony, the digest says that it's actually possible for a conviction to be based solely on the testimony of a child witness,
Oh.
as long as that testimony survives cross-examination. If the child can answer questions clearly and consistently, then their testimony might be enough to convict someone.
Wow. Okay. So the digest also reminds us about the important role that the high court plays when it's acting as the first court of appeal. So what does that mean exactly?
So the high court, as the first court of appeal, it has a really big job. It's not just rubber stamping what the lower court decided. They're supposed to look at all the evidence themselves and decide whether they agree with the lower court's decision or whether they need to change it.
So they have to do their own independent review of the case.
Yeah, they do.
Okay. So let's talk about something a little more practical. How does the compensation that's awarded in motor accident cases, how does that actually get paid out?
So to make things easier and faster for people who've been awarded compensation, tribunals are now asking for the claimant's bank account details so that the money can be sent directly to them electronically. And there are some rules about whose bank account it should be. Usually it should be the claimant's own account, but if the claimant is a minor, it'll be their guardian's account.
Yeah.
And it usually can't be a joint account with somebody who's not a family member.
Okay, so it's all about making sure that the money gets to the right people quickly and easily.
Exactly.
Okay, so we also came across this phrase in the digest, the doctrine of mandatory procedure. So what does that mean for people who are dealing with legal stuff?
So this doctrine is basically saying that if a law says you have to do something a specific way, then you have to do it that way. You can't take shortcuts or do it your own way. You have to follow the procedure that's laid out in the law.
Right, right. So no cutting corners, you got to follow the rules.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so last couple of things here. The digest talks about the Chief Justice of the High Court and some specific rules for advocates in the Supreme Court. So let's start with the Chief Justice. What kind of authority does the Chief Justice have?
So the Chief Justice of the High Court has the power to decide which judges will hear which cases. It's called the roster. And the digest makes clear that this is the Chief Justice's decision to make, and everyone else has to follow it. And importantly, if a judge hears a case that wasn't assigned to them by the Chief Justice, any orders they make in that case are considered invalid.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that really highlights how much power the Chief Justice has in making sure that the court system runs smoothly.
It does, yeah.
Okay, and then lastly, we get a little glimpse into the Supreme Court and some of the rules that advocates have to follow there.
Yeah, the digest talks about the procedure for filing what's called a vakalatnama, and that's basically a document that gives an advocate the authority to represent a client in court. And it also mentions these things called appearance slips, which are basically a way for advocates to let the court know that they're there and ready to argue a case. And there are also rules about when changes need to be made to the vakalatnama and things like that. It's all very procedural.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a very specific way of doing things at the Supreme Court.
There is, yeah.
Okay, well that was quite a journey. We covered a lot of ground today. We talked about arbitration, contracts, child custody, evidence, even the inner workings of the High Court and the Supreme Court. It's pretty amazing to see all the different issues that the Supreme Court is dealing with.
It is. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me is just how important it is to be precise in your legal documents, you know? Because the way things are worded can make a huge difference in how they're interpreted later on. And we also saw that idea of fairness coming up again and again, which I think is really encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about all these different principles about following procedures and about trying to achieve fairness and justice, it really raises a question for all of us. How do these things work together? How do we make sure that the system is fair to everyone? It's definitely something to think about as we see how these legal interpretations shape our society. And in understanding these legal concepts, it gives us a way to analyze what's happening in the world around us, to understand the news, and to think critically about the laws that govern our lives.
It does, yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
It was a pleasure.